to this shit. The New Jersey Council of Indian Affairs has announced plans to disrupt Monday's Columbus Day parade in Newark. Council Chairman Del Redclay, professor of cultural anthropology at
blowing your nose, I want to hear this.
Council members and supporters will lie down in the path of Columbus Day marches, quote, in protest of Columbus's role in the genocide of America's native peoples, unquote. To launch their protest, the Native Americans and their sympathizers plan to begin a death watch tomorrow over the statue of Columbus in Christopher Columbus Park.
Some fucking balls bad-mouthing America, especially now.
I thought Columbus was the hero of America.
Oh, see, it's these Indians and the commie fucks. They want to paint Columbus as a slave trader instead of an explorer.
You gotta admit, they did get massacred, the Indians.
It's not like we didn't give them a bunch of shit to make up for that.
Land, reservations.
And now they got the casinos.
The fuck we ever get we didn't have to work our balls off for?
I won't mind sitting on my ass all day, smoking mushrooms and collecting government checks.
You know what it is? I'll tell you what it is. It's anti-Italian discrimination. Columbus Day is a day of Italian pride. It's our holiday, and they want to take it away.
Fuck them. But I never liked Columbus.
Oh, hey, what?
In Napoli, a lot of people are not so happy for Columbus, because he was from Genova.
What's the problem with Genoa?
The north of Italy always have the money and the power. They punish the south since hundreds of years. Even today, they put up their nose at us like we're peasants. I hate the north.
Jesus, take it easy.
I'm gonna take action here.
Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I am your co-host, Scott Parkin in Berkeley, California. And as always, I'm joined by
Bob Bazanko, and good to be here today, especially since we're talking to an old comrade of mine about Indigenous Peoples Day, nay Columbus Day. But before I get started on that, I would like to just briefly point out, you can see behind me, today's the anniversary of the death of Che Guevara in Bolivia, October 9th, 1967. We're recording this a few days prior to October 12th. And I know, for our listeners and people on the left in general, Che has really been an iconic figure. And, given the turmoil we're in today, it's kind of fun to think about him and to think about how important he was to a generation that came of age in that period. Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Ho Chi Minh, Yasser Arafat, Thomas Sankara later. I mean, just so many people in this kind of global, international.
Patrice Lumumba.
I just think there was this global movement for human liberation, all over the world. And we're seeing, kind of inklings of that today. Again, we're starting to see these kind of global movements, which is really cool. And whenever that happens, I think, it's worthwhile to kind of think about Che a little bit, go back and read some of the things he wrote and, learn about some of the stuff he did. So anyway, here at the Green and Red podcast, we are always motivated by Che's idea that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. So having said that, I want to introduce a dear friend and comrade, Michael Oberg. Mike is a very distinguished professor of history at SUNY-Geneseo, received his PhD at Syracuse, has written a ton of stuff, Uncas, First of the Mohegans. I'm not going to go through all of it. The Head in Edward Nugent's Hand, Professional Indian, the American Odyssey of Eleazar Williams, and Peacemakers, the Iroquois, the U.S., and the Treaty of Canandaigua. Canandaigua, okay. And probably the standard textbook now in the field, Native America, A History, which was published by Wiley Blackwell, and which is also the title of his blog, which you can find on, just by doing a search on his name, or Native America, A History. Welcome to Green and Red Mike. And it is a celebration or a commemoration or a lamentation of Indigenous Peoples Day, nay Columbus Day today. And so to get started, why don't you tell us why this became a big deal, why this became, first of all, why it became a holiday, and then, what that holiday reflects and why so many people have issues with it, why it's so problematic.
Well,
and that'll only take an hour or two. So.
Yeah, look, Columbus Day found its origins in the early 20th century amongst Italian Americans who were themselves victims of bigotry and prejudice and discrimination. And what Italian Americans did was essentially claim Columbus as their own, right? That we're not un-American, that we're not enemies of the state. You mentioned Sacco and Vanzetti before we got started, that we're loyal citizens and we were there at the very beginning, right? So it was a measure to sort of buy into the American dream that we are here, we matter, and our history on this continent is deep. It's been celebrated pretty uncritically ever since, right? Christopher Columbus, the discoverer of America. And look, the movement towards Indigenous People Day, it seems to me, began around the time of the 500th anniversary of Columbus's voyage in the early 90s. And you began to see during that period some polemical scholarly works, Kirkpatrick Sale's The Conquest of Paradise and things like that, that really began sort of lifting the veil from over this myth of Columbus as this great explorer. And I think what has emerged over time is this notion that Columbus is a mythical figure. He's a symbol of all sorts of things. He's a symbol for those who embrace Columbus Day, and he is a symbol for those who embrace Indigenous Peoples Day, right? For President Trump, and you can go to the White House website and you can read President Trump's last couple of proclamations for Columbus Day. Hopefully this October, Monday, will be his last one. But what the president has done in these proclamations is he celebrates Columbus as a great explorer, as an adventurer, as the guy who discovered America, with no mention whatsoever of the consequences of the arrival of the Spanish and other Europeans in the Americas. No discussion of it at all. Whereas those who advocate for Indigenous Peoples Day say, well, look, there were consequences with this. And this whole sense that, when I went to I was in Syracuse from 1990 to 1994, and I was one of those tunnel vision grad students who didn't really pay attention to much other than what I was doing. I'd never seen snowfall before I moved to New York, so I just hunkered down and stayed in the library. And when I got my first job in Montana, I think one of my first years there, I was invited to participate in this NEH seminar on the Blackfeet Reservation, way up in the northwestern corner of Montana. And it was one of these gatherings where elementary and middle school teachers were coming together on the reservation to talk about young adult books and books for kids of that age. And one of these books was a book by the late Michael Doris called Morning Girl. It's kind of a cute story of this girl who lived on Guanahani in San Salvador. And it's sort of her and her brother and their hijinks, and they're having fun. And the book ends. The last page of the book is Columbus's letter when he got to North America. And this letter, it's the letter where he talks about, I didn't see anyone except for one young girl. And that's the girl we've been reading about. And a couple of paragraphs later, Columbus says, well, they'll make good servants. And I was listening to the discussion, and the Native American teachers at this gathering all said that they would use this book, but they would cut that last page out of the book. Physically, they would remove that Columbus letter from the book. It was too much for their students. And I have to admit, it's caught me a little off guard, but their point was, you've got this beautiful story of these two beautiful children. It's this great depiction of life. And at its end, you have Columbus, in 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue and contemplates out loud how indigenous children will make good slaves. Kids, children. It is too much, they felt, for the kids. And that's when I got started talking about this. I've never really Columbus wasn't my topic of research, but it's something I've been following very closely, and I think it's become more of an issue as we've gotten into the dispute over monuments and things like that, the removal of Confederate monuments. And as this healthy movement has got underway, Columbus has re-entered the discussion, and Columbus statues have been defaced. Just today, this is a Friday before Columbus Day, the mayor of Syracuse has announced that its huge Christopher Columbus statue in the city's Columbus Square will be removed and taken down in response to sort of a community-wide coalition, including the neighboring Onondaga Nation, to bring this down. But the reaction to this kind of stuff, and you see this in the president and in right-wing radio and all sorts of people, is that this is somehow an attack. It's unfamiliar. It's revisionist history, right? And what I think people outside of my line of work and your line of work, Bob and Scott, what they don't realize, right, is that history is being revised all the time. It's being revised in the scholarship. It's being revised in seminar rooms, and now, and I think this is the exciting part about it, it's being revised in the streets.
That's one of the things that's really kind of, I think, been really compelling in the past 6 months, especially. Like, you know, all of a sudden Americans are like captivated with all kinds of histories. I'm going to talk about the statues a little more, but, you know, obviously everybody who listens to this knows I grew up in a very Italian community, Sicilian actually, but Columbus for us actually wasn't that big a deal. And we opened this with a clip from the famous show, The Sopranos, where they're very upset because Native Americans are protesting Columbus. And, you know, growing up, we were actually more kind of familiar with cultural figures, you know, like Joe DiMaggio and Frank Sinatra. But recently, the governor of your state, who's a Paisan, Andrew Cuomo, when they were talking about Columbus, essentially, I forget what he said, you know, this is a symbol to the Italian, but what he meant was it's, you know, he didn't use the words, but what he was saying was the same thing Southerners were saying about Confederate monuments. It's heritage, not hate, you know? And, you know, you know, not all Italians feel that way. I mean, there are many of us who understand that this is really, you know, kind of a very painful reckoning for a lot of people. And it doesn't really, you know, make Italians look better or proud. But yeah, it does come within a context of, you know, some really serious anti-Italian problem, like in, you know, New Orleans in 1891, the lynching of Sicilians and the kind of equation with the mob and all that. So, you know, it's important to bring that out. And there is this reckoning with history. But, you know, when Americans first started, you know, kind of studying Columbus, was it like Samuel L. Morse and historians like that who kind of created this myth about him? Was there even any mention of natives when, you know, people started actually writing about this, like at the beginning of the 20th century, or were they always just eliminated from the picture?
No, at best, they almost are cast as the winged monkeys in Wizard of Oz, right? They don't mean anything unless they attack. Otherwise, they're dismissed completely. They're, you know, Frederick Jackson Turner, right? You know, he didn't write about the Caribbean, but the frontier, right? It's the outer edge of the wave, right? The meeting point between savagery and civilization. It's just this wave that erodes things. And look, the holiday, at all sorts of objective levels, it's just sort of dumb, right? Columbus never set foot in North America. Never set foot in North America. So he's become this, you know, this symbol of things. But, you know, I have this conservative Italian-American friend, and he said, you know, why couldn't they pick another day? Why not make another day Indigenous Peoples Day? There's 364 other days, and this is creating conflict where none is needed. And, you know, I mean, I think there's, you know, he says Italian Americans have done a lot for the country. They've suffered a lot of discrimination. They deserve their own day too. They shouldn't have to give up their day. Everyone can have a day, right? And I thought, okay, that's great. But I think for me, you know, so much of the writing about Columbus ignores the consequences of this encounter. It ignores Native peoples. They're invisible, right? And I think that's the problem. My own research, my own writing, I write about Indians, right? I don't want to talk about Columbus. I think what's far more interesting, right? If you look at the early explorers, you can talk about Columbus, you can talk about where I grew up in Southern California, you've got Cabrillo, right? You've got Coronado sort of wandering around the Southwest, realizing that these wheat fields, these grasslands are as hard to negotiate as the ocean, right? You've got You've got De Soto. In the South, you've got the French sending Cartier. And what do these guys in the 16th century accomplish? Nothing. Nothing. They come and they leave. They don't do anything. And what little they accomplish is solely because of the native peoples who enlist them in their battles, who exploit them as trade partners and cast them off once they realize they're of limited usefulness. For me, the indigenous people are a much more interesting part of the story, but we have to have these Europeans do that. So the invisibility of Indians in the Columbus Day narrative is the reason why I think the day ought to be replaced with Indigenous Peoples Day, so we can change the focus, right? And talking about Indigenous Peoples Day, and this is the point I talk about till I'm blue in the face with folks, it doesn't have to demean your coveted Western tradition. It doesn't have to demean the country. In fact, I'm sure you guys teach, right? How many times have you had a student come up to you and say, you know, I feel like I've been cheated because of the crap I was taught in high school? Right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
My teachers are lying to me. You get it when you do the progressive era. You get it when you do the 60s. You get it when you cover slavery. You know, you want to damage kids, keep bullshitting them. But if you give them,
yeah.
Are we allowed to cuss on this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let it go.
So
yeah.
If we're
Trump did it today on Fox News, so if he dropped an F-bomb, we can do a dozen. You know.
So I think that. There's no reason why this has a damage thing. And you mentioned the president and the stupid White House history conference. It didn't take place at the White House and didn't have any historians on the panel. The president is talking about this insidious plot to undermine America. And he was talking about the 1619 Project. He's talking about Howard Zinn's book, which is what, 40 some years old, 42
oh, yeah.
now, something like that. I mean, it's. I think everyone who loves it recognizes it's a great but flawed book. Enormously influential, right? It's the gateway drug for at least my generation of historians into looking at the history of non-elites. But they see this all as a menace and a threat, and it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We can talk about Columbus on Indigenous Peoples Day, and we can talk about the fact that he came here seeking, wealth, right? Nothing about this country was not founded on liberty and freedom. It was founded on making money, right? And Columbus was looking for wealth, and he couldn't find anything, right? I mean, he wasn't thinking tourism when he got there. The Caribbean's gorgeous, but he was thinking of mineral wealth. And very quickly, he turns to slavery. 1495, his men round up 1,600 people, and he takes the 500 best of them, loads them on ships and ships them back to Spain. 200 of those 500 died on the way back, cast overboard. The next year, he wrote about a bigger plan for over 1495, 1496. He wanted to bring 4,000 indigenous slaves back to Iberia. And the Queen, that would require what? A couple of dozen ships to do something like that. The Queen was not interested in bankrolling that sort of investment, but that gives you a sense of where we're thinking. And you can jump from Columbus just a couple of years later to Botelines de las Casas, right? And the devastation of the Indies, and you have a book that is really the chronicle of the first modern genocide in modern history, right? Of Spanish ships being able to sail home without the aid of navigational instruments because they can follow the floating corpses of indigenous slaves thrown overboard, or of, shops in New Spain where you could buy human flesh to feed your dogs. You could read about Spanish conquistadors having contests to see how many Indians they could spear with one thrust of the pike, and grabbing babies by the heels and bashing their brains out. It's a horrific story. There is nothing edifying about this story at all, save for the fact that indigenous people survived it and they're still here. And face the facts, right? That there are indigenous people around today to advocate for Indigenous Peoples Day is a triumph and well worth celebrating.
Scott, or you?
Yeah, you know, it's as a I was a history teacher as well. I taught community college in Houston before I moved to the Bay Area and did what I did. And I used to teach. I used to basically teach out of Zen when I kind of taught this period, and it always like what kind of struck me is like I feel like it's the sort of what Trump is tapping into, because I taught in the suburbs of Houston, like places like Clear Lake and Pasadena and places like that, and it's just like the even so that was late 90s, early 2000s, and the sort of vitriol though that when you would like kind of tell them this piece, like there was a study last year in 2019 that something like 55 million natives died between Columbus landing and like the early 1600s, and they were just like they didn't believe it. And it's just like amazing to me the sort of like the kind of there's a mass denial that still kind of exists around this, even though and then when there's like my day job now is I work at an environmental organization. I work with Indigenous people all the time, and it's just like, you know, constantly advocating on this piece. Like there's a lot of other things that, you know, they're advocating on, whether it's pipelines or Indigenous rights, what have you, but like, you know, they are completely demonized and targeted in like really racist ways. Part of it is just blatant racism, but it's just like, it's just amazing to me that like, here we are in 2020, that this still continues.
Yeah.
And those are some of the, you know, some of the best people I work with and some of the strongest, smartest people I work with. And they just have to deal with that every day.
It comes up a lot, right? I mean, it comes with doing what we do, but I think we have to engage those people, right? And I, you know, it's to come back to the president, right? And I don't mean just to pick on the president, because
feel free, we do it all the time.
Well, but he's, you know, Trump's a symptom of a problem, and he's mouthing things that have been mouthed for decades, right? I mean, a lot of the stuff that's being said about the 1619 Project could have, you could substitute the national history standards from the mid 1990s.
Yeah, Lynn Cheney. Yeah.
Right. And I think, you know, it's, I do have this faith in sort of urgent Socratic dialogue, being able to move some of these people who raise these arguments to wisdom, because we don't, I mean, there's huge debates over the number of people in the Americas prior to Columbus's voyage. And there's a wide range of reasonable estimates. It doesn't change the fact that within 4 or 5 decades of Columbus's arrival, the Caribbean was a ghost town. It was depopulated. Similar things happened beginning in the 17th century. Students are shocked when they learn that more Native American slaves were exported from the Carolinas before 1700 than African slaves imported. Right? They are shocked when they're told that 2/3 of the people who crossed the Atlantic to English America between 1630 and 1780 were slaves, Africans. And so they'll argue, well, African American history isn't American history. It's this adjunct. It's this politically correct topic. No, it's central to the whole thing. And in a state like, you know, you guys were in Houston, you were in Caddo country, right? Natchitoches is up the road. You've got all these, you still got these indigenous place names around there. New York, where I live, New York simply could not have taken the shape it has today in the way that it has without a systematic program of Indian dispossession. I teach at a college in Geneseo. It's what it's called. Geneseo is a Seneca place name. It goes back to the 1600s. Everyone knew where Geneseo was in the 1600s. It was a major town, and there are people in Geneseo who have no sense of that history. And I think it's really unfortunate. And I think it saddens me in a way, because I think we have these classrooms that are increasingly diverse, and this increasing mix of people. And when we start telling these stories, we start telling these students, these kids, right, that their stories matter. And when we start telling them their stories matter, we start telling them in essence that they are themselves forces of history. And I think that's where you see the students get turned on by this sort of stuff. And then they start asking these questions, and I don't care what they ask about history, but you see them starting asking questions to people who have power, people who make statements without evidence, and you have suddenly citizens who are willing to speak truth to power. And I hate to break this to the current leaders of the Republican Party, but that's what citizenship's about, right? You can go back to Socrates for that. You speak truth to power. So it's a drag that we don't want to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, the first day of the semester, I always ask my students why we study history. And, you know, the typical answer is so we can learn from mistakes of the past. And, you know, I point out nobody ever learns from their past mistakes. I've been divorced twice. So, but, you know, basically we study history to make yourself feel good about your society, about your ruling class, and to kind of cover up, you know, these kind of atrocities in many cases in the past. And one thing that strikes me about Columbus is, you know, Columbus is actually standing for Spain, which is another reason I never understood the kind of how Italians embraced him. But, you know, we kind of
why not Amerigo Vespucci?
Yeah, right. Or, you know, like I said, Sacramento, Yogi Berra, you know, Connie Francis, you know, there's a lot of them out there. Lady Gaga, Tony Bennett. But, you know, there's also this history of American atrocities, too, you know, in the colonial era. In Virginia, the Pequot War, probably the best example of those. And, you know, I found out about all this really from Howard Zinn, you know, because he, you know, I wasn't familiar with De las Casas before I read Howard Zinn. And I think, you know, you're right. His book is kind of, I think it's very romantic. But, you know, there's some stuff in there that's absolutely essential. You know, you're teaching specifically, you know, courses in this, so they're going to get a lot of stuff from you. And I don't really teach the first half of the survey anymore, but when I did, I talked about that. But I don't get the sense that most, you know, history teachers or history professors, you know, even really kind of approach this stuff. And how do you deal with that? How do you try to tell people that this is important, not just, you know, because we want to get the history right, but it has all kinds of implications for the way we, you know, structure society, power dynamics, you know, what the ruling class can get away with.
Well, I start the class by asking them, you know, it's sort of saying, what do you know about Native American history?
Yeah.
And then usually it's all wrong or romantic or simplified. And it's not the student's fault, but that's what they've been taught.
Cinematic, I'm sure a lot of it's from the movies.
Yeah. And so I tell them, look, everything you've been taught is wrong. And that kind of gets them hooked. And I ask them, well, why are you being taught stuff that's wrong? Is it that your teachers are idiots and they don't know what they're talking about? Or is it because the curricula that they're being required to teach is the people who put that together are afraid to confront certain realities about the past? And we can talk about that all they want, but I think by putting it in those terms, that it's sort of attractive to them that they're in on something now, right? They're gonna unearth this conspiracy, right? We're gonna find out who the rats are and find out where the bodies are buried and start doing it. But the fact of the matter is, you know, all my students, pretty much all our students come from New York State. So I am teaching New Yorkers. But I write a textbook for everyone in North America. And I think the thing is that this country's history can't be understood apart from Indians, right? You mentioned the Pequot War. The Pequot War is often depicted as it's this horrible massacre, right? They burn this town that they're unable to fight their way into. What they don't realize is that the English are essentially the stooges of different indigenous powers in this war, right? And again, if you shift the focus to native peoples and indigenous peoples, you get a much different look at this whole period. You can argue, right, that the American Revolution to some extent resulted from the inability of the empire to prevent warfare with Indians, right? I mean, you got the French and Indian War, and then you've got Pontiac's Rebellion, the Proclamation of 1763, which angers the Virginians, and then you have this disastrous period of policy of taxation, which was, you know, justified on the grounds that the empire needed to defray at least a portion of the cost of defending this territory it had acquired from France. It's central to everything. And then again in New York, right? I mean, I teach in Geneseo. I go shopping in Irondequoit, in Nunde, in Tonawanda, in Cohocton. It's everywhere around you here. And while the students may learn something about Indian removal, that when they cover Indian removal in high school, they learn about Cherokee removal. They don't learn about the removal of Indians from New York State. Well, why is that? Why is that? why are they not taught that? Well, part of it's because the Cherokees made the whole debate about themselves to some extent, but the simple fact is it makes people uncomfortable, right? If you're a landowner in this state, New York, just like, you know, where you are in Ohio, Bob, and you are too, Scott, right? You're a beneficiary of dispossession.
Yeah, sure.
And you are. It doesn't matter that you did nothing. You are a beneficiary. So that's my pitch.
Well, you know, my graduate field was actually U.S. diplomatic history, foreign relations. And so I learned about all those, you know, we read extensively in that. So, you know, coming out of it, I actually probably knew more than most people did because of that. I don't know if they still really study that any longer. And, you know, we're going to do a show on the 1619 project, hopefully soon. But, you know, it strikes me that that's become the centerpiece and the you know, and I think it's somewhat problematic in some ways, but it seems to me that there's no corollary for Native American history, nothing close to this focus. And obviously, you know, American slavery is immense. But I mean, what wasn't kind of one of the initial plans to actually enslave both in the Spanish colonies and the British colonies? Wasn't one of the original plans to actually use the Indians for forced labor, the Native Americans? And, you know, when this kind of went awry with things like Bacon's Rebellion, that's kind of the textbook explanation of that. Is that realistic, or is that?
Well, most of the colonial promoters, the people in England who are writing about it, they want to profit from their colonial ventures. They want to establish secure footholds on American shores, and they want to spread what they saw as the one and only true religion. And of course, the French and English could fight over and Spanish could fight over what that is. Most of them realized that they could achieve those goals most easily and least expensively with the assistance of indigenous people.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the people on the ground doing the settling, they want to extract wealth from the land. And in places like the South, Virginia and the Carolinas, and in New England after King Philip's War, there's massive enslavement of Native peoples. You don't necessarily see those slaves working in labor camps in the colonies, right? Most of those indigenous slaves are shipped out to the British Caribbean or the English Caribbean, right? So, and there historians have worked on trying to track them down. Where a number of books have come out in recent years, sort of getting a sense of the numbers, and it's significant. It's more than anyone had anticipated. So, Pequot War captives shipped out to the Caribbean. King Philip's War captives shipped out to the Caribbean if they aren't absorbed by the Iroquois. So, and of course, Virginia and the Carolinas, you have this series of enslavement where one group is armed to go get slaves for the next, and eventually you run out of Indians to enslave, and the Carolinas blow up into warfare in the first couple of decades of the 18th century, the Yamasee War and the Tuscarora War, that essentially brings those colonies to their knees. So indigenous slavery, and you know, that it's been in the last 15, 20 years with Alan Galay's book a couple decades back, and then a series of books since then. No one was talking about indigenous slavery much before that, but now it's at the center of scholarly discussions. The Brett Rushforth's book on the Western Great Lakes and the French colonies, slavery runs through that. There's this notion that the French were somehow the nice colonizers. No, they were engaged in the slave trade as everyone else was. Slavery is ubiquitous, and indigenous slavery was a constant.
You know, this summer I actually read Richard Slotkin's Regeneration Through Violence, and you know, there's a big focus in there on King Philip's War, but the kind of like central thesis is that that the American myth or the American narrative is basically like nothing without the Indian Wars. And like, you know, we're talking about like kind of cultural piece around Columbus and how that's like been so integrated, and it's like much more of a subtle thing where this sort of like Indian War is just like kind of going up to Frederick Jackson Turner is like, it's why we have such, you know, why there's such an emphasis on violence in American culture. I'm just wondering if you could, you know, comment on that.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've read Slotkin, right? But that you know, look, right. You have the Intercept report from a couple years back where law enforcement officials were looking at the DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline protesters, and describing them in terms as jihadists. You have the names of our, the Apache helicopter and things like that. You have Indian country being used as sort of a metaphor in the Vietnam War and probably in the more recent conflicts as well. It provides a language for American conflicts that's been there constantly. And I think the bigger thing that I think students need to realize is, again, how ubiquitous this violence was. I mean, in general, the violence in early America was mind-blowing by our standards, right? So, slaves and pirates and gibbets at the ports and all that. But, you take an event like the Paxton Boys massacre in December of 1763, and you have these people breaking into essentially a jail where these Conestogas are being kept for their own protection, Christian Indians, and these savages, right? The Paxton Boys, they kill them all, and they kill 3- and 4-year-olds with hatchets. When I teach this to kids, I kind of stand close to the kid sitting in the front row, because his height sitting on a chair would be the height of a child, right? And just, for me to reach that kid with a hatchet, right? And just get a sense of the intimacy of this violence. And the argument I make, and I make this in a textbook, and I make this, I think, in a number of the things I write, is that how do these people get there?
Mm-hmm.
How do you get to a point where you can carry out that kind of violence and justify it? Because if you can't explain it, you really can't explain any of American history, because there's so much of that towards different peoples of color over the broad expanse over several centuries of this history. And it gets old, man. It gets tiring to read it, because it can bring you, writing a textbook, man, I got depressed.
Yeah.
Because it was just like, my training was as an early American historian, so that was sort of my first venture. I taught it, but to really, really read all the literature, and now I kind of stay up on all the literature. It's just, is it getting better? Well, yeah, there's more plumbing on the reservation. There's more houses with electricity. Life expectancy is slowly going up. But racism towards Native peoples is real, and it's continuing. You mentioned it, Scott. I saw it especially when I taught in Montana, where at the college where I taught, Montana State at Billings, Native American students were quite clearly an unwelcome and despised minority on campus. And any of these measures of social well-being, incarceration rates, their likelihood of being killed by police, infant mortality rates, life expectancy, heart disease, cirrhosis, all these kinds of problems, suicide rates, right? By any of these measures, Native peoples are suffering. and it just is constant. And just to read it took some long walks. It required long walks when I was writing that, just to kind of get through it, because sometimes, and when you read stories like the things our president says, or you read some of these violent crimes that I write about on the blogs, these murders that take place, or this scourge of missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? The listeners of this blog can follow the hashtag MMIW on Twitter. It's unreal. I mean, it's just devastating. Go ahead, Scott. I'm sorry.
We've kind of this year we've seen some like progress in some of the cultural stuff. I would say, of like, we see like here in the Bay Area, San Francisco took its Columbus statue down before a bunch of rabble-rousers could go tear it down. We've seen city and states change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. The Washington Redskins are going to change their name. Do you think that's going to translate into like more material gain? I mean, like the county Pine Ridge is in is most poverty-stricken county healthcare on reservations is terrible. Navajo, and as a result, like the Navajo Nation was devastated by COVID this year.
Right.
And so, like, do you think we'll see some material gain
Well, I hope
from this
so.
cultural progress?
I mean, my college a couple of years back implemented we do a territorial acknowledgement at the beginning of campus gatherings, where this is the land of this Seneca Nation and the Tonawanda Seneca Nation. Say that out loud. We say that to rooms with there's no Native American students. And look, other than some dingbat football fans and the people producing logoed sweatshirts and stuff, all these things you're talking about, taking down a Columbus statue, changing from Columbus Day to Indigenous People Day, it doesn't cost you or I anything.
Right.
Easy. And that's what, and so let's do something more meaningful. I thought, I suggested we fly the Haudenosaunee flag on our college flagpole. This is sort of just one small gesture to make it a welcoming place. Won't do it. Governor won't allow it. Or hire someone to recruit Native American students and hire Native American faculty, so that there's some kind of community on campus when these students come. There's no money for this kind of stuff. So I hope there's serious change, but I think, look, man, you're a historian. When it actually starts costing white people stuff, that's when you get the reaction. So am I optimistic? I've been at this a long time. No, I'm not optimistic. I'll keep doing what I can to try to make it happen. And I think a lot of people way more talented and committed than I am, especially young people, are doing amazing stuff to make this happen, right? The DAPL protest, that was a big deal.
Yeah, I would say that was a watershed moment.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it started, I think, with Amy covering it, but then because of those kids and the young people with their cell phones, they made it a national story. So, and similarly, we wouldn't be having this Black Lives Matter movement if it weren't for young people with bystanders with phones.
Yeah.
So looking at, I'll change my answer, right? Looking at younger people, I can feel optimistic that some of this change will come. Right. And every once in a while, I got one of these students who's fired up, and they like, what can I do? And I even had this one a couple of years ago, and he's like, I want to do something about this. He's a kid who went to UH, Andrew Reiser. He followed me there, only I ditched him. But he wanted to do something about it. He's a Jewish kid from New York City. So he interned at the NARF, Native American Rights Fund, right? I mean, I've had these students who talk their way into these amazing, white kids from the suburbs talking themselves in these positions where they can actually do something. And so I think that if we get out of the young people's way, meaningful change can happen. But there's a lot of old people like us who are part of the problem, who don't want to get uncomfortable, who don't want to have to pay anything. We don't want to have it cost us anything. If they cost us something, whether it's real or perceived, we're out. And so let's hope for the young people to break some windows, right?
I mean, the theme here is Columbus Day, but there's so much more to it. And, we've talked about the 1619 Project, and obviously none of us are trying to create a tension between African-American history and Native American history. But clearly, I think African-American history, we know more about it. There is the 1619 Project. There's no analog for Native American history. I haven't been up on the literature really forever, but especially in the last 20, 25 years ago, I remember teaching Michael Rogan, I think, book, where he talks about, how removing Native Americans from the Southeast was critical for expanding cotton plantations, the primitive accumulation. And, that's a really critical part of a U.S. history that, if I hadn't read that book, I probably wouldn't even know it. And that's, kind of what I do. And so how do you kind of get around? I mean, is there the possibility of creating a 1492 project or whatever year this Pequot War, I can't remember, I mean, is there some way to kind of, because that's every bit as critical. And I know when 1619 came out, there were criticisms of it. That was one of the criticisms of it, that Native American history and the creation of this state was, when people talk about settler colonialism, to me, that's far more applicable to natives than it is to slaves who are actually brought over here, right? So is there some way to kind of create an analog to 1619 to kind of get people more aware of just how important and central, maybe more than any other kind of history, Native American history is to what became the United States?
I hope so. I would love to see someone at the New York Times do a similar project for Native Americans or anyone. I have that in mind with the textbook. We're going to start doing a third edition soon, so that'll be out in 2022, I think, is what I agreed to. So and I think I will write, or I got a co-writer helping me, but I think we'll look at the third edition as being an analog to that, and I think it's absolutely essential. And look, the 1619 project, of course, it's been criticized for various things. But it's a synthesis, right? It's an attempt to bring together a lot of literature, a vast historiography, and to cover this vast field in a relatively small space. So that we historians are quibbling about it and arguing about it doesn't diminish the importance of what it was. And with the Native American Project too, I think you will have similar arguments. And the historians know those arguments are good. They're healthful. They're part of the game. We don't shy away from these arguments, right? The problem, and I think that's sort of the challenge that the 1619 project has posed for a lot of people who are against it is 1619 can basically say, okay, prove us wrong. But they won't do that, right? And you see this with the president, you see it with others. They say, oh, it's an attack against America. And they never put themselves, not once, they're the biggest goddamn cowards. They will never put themselves in a position where you can say, okay, how does this undermine love of country? What is wrong with this depiction of the past? What is wrong with talking about systemic inequality or systemic racism? They're afraid of the freaking discussion. We historians, we don't shy away from the argument. And that's the challenge, is because we're trying to convince people who are not arguing in good faith. And that's what any kind of Native American project would run up against. But I think look, man, I've got a limited skill set. I went to school. I've read a lot of books, and you could start
a podcast.
I can throw some sentences together, right?
Yeah.
So I'll do what I can do, and I think I can talk to 100 students a semester, and I can write, and you guys do the same, and you reach an audience with a podcast. All we can do is keep doing it.
Yeah.
And look how far it's gone, right? What, 5 years ago? Was there, if I wrote #BLM on the side of a wall, would anyone know what that is? It's a relatively short amount of time. MMIW, missing and murdered Indigenous women, no one would know what that is. These things have grabbed people's attention, and it's, and in a sense, things like missing and murdered Indigenous women, that movement, starting with like Idle No More and things like that in Canada, that predated the historians. Right, the activists are in front of the historians, and the historians are following up and adding some heft and saying, "Look, these kids are onto something. They got it right." We've got some catching up to do. But I think,
and I don't know more are grandmothers too. It's the Indigenous grandmothers. Yeah.
Right. So elders too, but using the technology that our kids are so comfortable with, and so willing to use for social good. So I would love to see this continue to grow, but the obstacles are enormous. But they're nothing we haven't seen, right? When the New Left, right? When you were doing your foreign policy stuff or your diplomatic history, and what Walter Lefebvre, right, was dangerous, right? And things like that, right? the national history standards that talk about slavery was dangerous. We hear this all the time.
Yeah.
We can win that fight. If we can get anyone in the ring, we can win that fight.
That's one of the things I always point out to lefties, especially, is, Howard Zinn's actually kind of mainstream now, not for Trump, but a lot of the stuff that Zinn talked about, is kind of standard. I used to do these summer, I think a lot of them were NAH seminars for history teachers. I did many of them all over the country, especially in Houston. And these are high school teachers, and, they weren't shocked by any of this. It was kind of the way they were teaching high schools, even in Texas. So that was encouraging. Before we go on, we're going to do a little, tell people what they're listening to, and thank them for listening to us and asking them to share, our podcast and all that. So, Scott, you're better at this than I am. So
I'll also say that nonprofits like the Zinn Education Project have actually been really good about providing teachers, even like elementary school teachers, with good curriculum around some of that, around people's history. But yes, folks, you're listening to Michael Oberg, and we are talking about Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, here on the Green and Red podcast. If you want to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we would love to have you follow us and like and comment all of our posts. And then we also have a YouTube channel, and please go to YouTube and hit subscribe. YouTube is a relatively new thing for Green and Red, but we've been having a lot of good video that we've put up. And so definitely check out our YouTube channel. And then we're also on all of your podcast listening platforms, which you're probably listening to right now. So if you're already listening, maybe go down and hit rate and review about what a great podcast we are. Give us a 5-star review. And then last, if you want to become a donor to Green Red Podcast, we're at patreon.com/Green Red Podcast. You can become a recurring donor there, or you can make a one-time donation at our wonderful, wonderful website called greenredpodcast.org. So yeah, become a fan and a follower of Green and Red Podcast.
We're becoming a media empire. Look out, Murdoch. We're coming at you.
Yeah. And also give us money so we don't have to take money from Chevron and Bank of America and all the corporate sponsors.
They've been throwing it at us, but we keep saying no.
Yeah, we keep turning them down.
Not today, Satan.
Not today, Satan. What do you say to the God of death? Not today. Kind of like shifting a little bit. I think we were talking about this before we got started, but I was reading your blog before we kind of kicked off this episode over the last couple of days, and there was a blog you posted about Reynold High Pine, and kind of going back to some of the hoping to see some of the cultural progress turn into material gains. Can you tell us a little bit about Reynold High Pine and the sort of epidemic of police killings on reservations and of Native people?
Yeah, this was a story I stumbled across. I was reading a Haudenosaunee newspaper called Akwesasne Notes, which was really important in the late 60s or early 70s. It's sort of an activist American Indian movement newspaper. I was working on a book project, had nothing to do with this, but they had these little digests from around the country. And because I'd lived for 4 years in Billings, Montana, and it was my first teaching job, the story of Reynold High Pine caught my attention. He was a tiny guy, right? 5'2" or 3", 130 pounds. And story goes, he got drunk, stumbled in front of a freight train about early in the evening, and was struck by that train and died. And his body was found in the freight yard on Billings South Side, which is that was the rough part of town. Witnesses had seen him at a bar at midnight, several hours after he'd supposedly died, where he'd gotten beaten up by an off-duty police officer, still in uniform, who was working as a bouncer at a bar. This cop had a whole foot taller than him, 50 pounds heavier than at least 50, much bigger guy, and beating him to death, or beating him so badly that he died thereafter. This cop's still alive, by the way. If I were in Billings, I would follow this story up. But it was one of these stories where a cause of death was determined pretty quickly, that it was an accidental death. He was struck by a train, and no one believed it. And there were a pair of AIM activists, American Indian Movement activists, who were students at Montana, what was then called Eastern Montana College, where I ended up teaching. And they started organizing, calling into question. And they built coalitions, right? They appealed to a very moderate Native American Businessmen's Association in Billings, ranchers and people like that, and they didn't buy it either. So the authorities in Billings were forced to call a coroner's inquest to take testimony, and they came out with a ruling or a decision that High Pine's death was probably accidental, and they highlighted or they underlined that word probably. I had considerable doubts about this, but it was just it just struck me as this was a couple decades ago. And it just struck me as such a resonant story with what we're seeing with Black Lives Matter and with a number of the stories of Native peoples who've died at the hands of police that I've written about on the blog. And again, many of these instances were police brutality or vigilantes shooting Indians or people who had mental illness, right? A guy in Omaha a couple of years back who was licking the windows of a gas station where people were dining on the other side of it. Clearly someone who was not well, yelling at people, walking around, not dressed for the weather, and was gunned down by the police. A kid who's written suicide notes, who's holding a butcher knife, or not even a butcher knife, but a kitchen knife, and the police shoot him. And so I when I see these stories, I write about them. They're not enough to write a whole article or a whole book on, but they do allow me to make these connections between the past and the present. And that's one of the things I want people to do, or I hope people do who read it, is that they'll see these connections and they'll see these parallels. And Zachary Bear Heels is one of these guys who just didn't get justice, right? You can't read that case and believe that the beating he had at the hands of this off-duty police officer had nothing to do with this. And, he was outside the bar, Zachary Bear Heels was. He may have been mouthing off to some women there or whatever the case may be. But the policeman just went nuts on him. And 5 hours later, his body's found in the railroad yard, not all that far from the bar. And again, it just gets old, right? It keeps happening again and again and again, these stories. And when I taught in Billings, I was a colonial historian, right? And we had one of these terrible deans or provosts there. And she goes, you gotta do applied research. I thought, well, what the hell is applied research? I'm a colonial historian. I don't even know what this means. Yeah. So I started talking to my Native American students. Just started saying, hey, can I turn on a tape recorder and why don't you tell me what it's like? And, Hardin, Montana, which is about 60 miles from Billings, it's a border town on the Crow Indian Reservation. You stop in Hardin to get gas when you go to the Little Bighorn battlefield site. So it's a lot of people passing through. These young people who were students at my school went to school with no dogs or Indians signs in buildings. This is in the 80s, right? This isn't long. 80s and 90s. They're told by their gym teacher to, hey, make sure you take a leak before you get on the field. They need the water down at Crow, right? This over the top racism. And and I went when I started paying attention to Crow. This is in 95, 96. At Hardin High School, they had like a culture day, right? So like the Polish students made pierogies and the Native American students made fry bread or whatever. And the white parents, a lot of white parents, they walked. They pulled their kids out of school. We don't want to be. And so these Crow students, they're 15, 16, so they shot off their mouths a little bit and complained about racism. And next day, distributed throughout Hardin was this white man's Bible, right? This kind of this Christian identity tract that, only white people are God's creation and this kind of stuff. And, so I started talking to people, and the racism in Montana towards Native Americans was so virulent and so openly expressed that this story from a couple of decades back, I can't remember what the date of the Reynold High Pine story was, It just,
I think it was 1972, maybe.
72. So, you know, I'm going 40, 50 years ago. It was really, really discouraging because it seemed that very little had changed in Billings. And I know much has changed. They have a good curriculum, or a decent curriculum in their schools. But the racism is there and it's not going away.
You know, you talked about police, well, we just talked about police killings. And, you know, even since George Floyd, I've read, I don't know, a fair number of stories about police killing Native Americans, which I think I probably saw in, you know, kind of more left-oriented media. And, you know, we're seeing right now, you know, like Harley Davidson and NASCAR supporting Black Lives Matter, but nothing really kind of parallel to Native Americans. So even liberals don't really want to touch that. I mean, no. And Obama was the guy who sent the troops out to Dapple, right? So,
yeah.
You know, is this, I mean, why is it, you know, apparently much easier and kind of hip now, right? There's kind of this hip commodification of African-American lives, but nothing at all similar for Indian lives, which are, you know, objectively, you know, in any criteria, poverty rates and healthcare rates and suicide rates, the worst in America, the worst in the United States.
Well, part of, I mean, there's obviously a geographic factor, right? And that Black Lives Matter is taking place in American cities. It's taking place in media markets. And the African-American population is much larger than the Native American population. That's part of it. Second, you know, these stories I pick up on, you know, I follow a thing called Indians.com, INDIANZ.com, which is sort of a daily digest of news stories from around the country that just picks up on Native American issues. And you'll see it in regional newspapers, right? In Nebraska or South Dakota or whatever, when they get covered. But look, there's, you know, I mean, all this other news so absorbs the media's attention that they don't pay any attention to Indians. And again, you're right about Obama. Obama did nothing to help to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. It was going forward. He reacted to the violence, similarly to the Kennedy administration and the Freedom Rides, right? The protests forced their hand in a certain level. And by that point, it was too late. He could say all he wanted. The pipeline was almost done, and it would be an easy thing for Trump to come in and just undo it once he did it. And that's exactly what happened. Yeah,
he didn't actually he didn't reject the permit or whatever it was until like after the election.
Yeah. It was way too late. And look, again, like I mentioned before, it was those protesters who made the story.
Yeah. Well, while we're talking about liberals, and lately we've seen this, this iconography about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, another sacred liberal who we like to talk about here on Green and Red. And she, I don't know if she was the author of the opinion, but she, which was, issued one of the, you know, most important and really critical decisions in court history about Native Americans. And you want to talk about RBG, the notorious RBG.
Yeah, well, let me just give you a little background here, right? And the Constitution says almost nothing about Indians, but what it does say in Article 1, Section 8 is that Congress has the power to regulate commerce with the Indian tribes. And in the first federal Congress passed a piece of legislation known as the Trade and Intercourse Act that spelled out what that meant. And one of the provisions that said that in order for a purchase of Indian land to be valid, it had to be done by Congress, overseen by the national government, and the resulting agreement had to be ratified by the Senate. New York bought a lot of land in violation of the Trade and Intercourse Act. And in the 1970s, Indian tribes started suing. Well, in the case in question, is called Oneida Indian Nation versus Sherrill, town of Sherrill. The Oneida Indian Nation had purchased land on the open market from willing sellers, and they, you know, had the district court and the circuit court had all ruled that was now Indian land. It came off the tax rolls. Town of Sherrill began foreclosure proceedings, and then the case goes before the Supreme Court. And Ginsburg wrote the opinion in Sherrill for an 8-1 court. And what she argued is that, yes, New York State had purchased Indian land in violation of the Trade and Intercourse Act. And yes, that law says that those sales are not valid. However, they took place too long ago, and any remedy would be more disruptive than the original crime. And she pointed out that the indigenous population of Madison and Oneida County, where the tract in question is located, was like 1%. And that's why it would be disruptive. And she completely ignores the fact that how that became 1%, right? Originally it was 100%, then it became down to 1%. It didn't just happen. It's not like the leaves falling every fall. It was a crime. It was a violation of the laws of the United States. She said, yep, it was, but it's too long ago. You're shit out of luck. And rumor has it, the story goes, that she regretted that decision towards the end of her life. I was surprised, frankly, when she joined the majority in the recent McGirt decision. I thought that was a case where she would say that it would be overly disruptive to allow these reservation boundaries still to exist. And McGirt's a whole long story that, you know, you can read about on the blog if you want.
That's the Oklahoma case they just recently.
Yeah, that's the Oklahoma case.
And Gorsuch held with the opinion, with the majority, right?
Yeah. She and Gorsuch both ruled. Yeah. Gorsuch, I think, wrote the opinion, and Gorsuch has been a guy on the court who believes treaties matter. So that has been a bit of a surprise, I think, for many of us. But not that. But Ginsburg's decision, what it did was shut off all the Indian land claims in New York State. And look, New York Indians, they weren't seeking to throw anyone off the land. They had the right. What they wanted was damages, rent for using the land. And they wanted the ability to purchase the land back on the open market from willing sellers and reconstitute the reservations again. She said, no, too late, too disruptive, it's gone. And whether she regretted it or not, the damage it did was significant, because that doctrine, the Latsis doctrine, right? The damages took place too long ago, has been used in other cases to the detriment of Native peoples.
It's a similar argument that when Africans or African Americans are asking for reparations from slavery, et cetera, that's also the sort of line. This is like too long ago, damage is already done.
I didn't do it. Yeah.
We're kind of getting close, but one question which kind of goes back to Trump, because I know at one point wasn't he trying to buy a casino, and he was like very publicly upset that Native Americans were working, and that kind of whole issue of casinos is, I think, really big in popular culture, and kind of a lot of whites I've heard use as an excuse, well, they have all this money from the casinos. And how does that actually play out? I mean, my assumption is that there's a small percentage of people who are actually getting the wealth off of those, and it doesn't really trickle down. Is that really the case? Or am I wrong?
Well, there's casinos all over the country, and Indian casinos all over the country. Some are immensely lucrative. Some barely scrape by. Right, and it depends. Like those along the I-95 corridor, they do pretty well. I don't know how all of them do with their business, but in New York, what you see is the proceeds from the casino go back into the community, and it's fantastic, right? So Seneca Nation, for example, they have a couple of casinos, one in Buffalo, one in Niagara Falls. One in the southern tier, right, or southwestern part of the state, right? I think they're the largest employer in Niagara Falls, which is sort of like, saying you're the skinniest kid at fat camp, but it's still an accomplishment. Niagara Falls is pretty decrepit. But look, so I'll give you a quick example, because I know we're running out of time, but Seneca Nation always had dumpy school buses. The worst school buses were used to bus their kids. So they said, fine, what we'll do is we'll reinvest this casino money in our own fleet of school buses. We'll hire our own people as fleet mechanics and as clerks and as bookkeepers and as drivers to get this going. So the revenue from the casinos, it's not a one-shot deal. It's part of sovereignty, right? It goes back into the community, and it underwrites other kinds of economic enterprises which strengthen these nations. So are people getting rich on some reservations? Yeah, Little Six in Minnesota, a lot of money. The Chumash Casino, not far from where I grew up in California, tons of money coming in there, for sure. But those are the exceptions. And you'll hear stories about those exceptions where they make a big deal out of them. But that's much more of this money goes in to fuel other kinds of economic enterprises to the benefit of the people in the community.
More disinformation from Trump. It's a shock.
Well, yeah, and he's just a racist too. So.
Oh, he's a lot of things. Right now, he's a drug-addled, unhinged maniac. But anyway, I don't know if there's anything you want to say to finish up. It's becoming a bigger issue. I'm right here in Ohio right now, where a lot of people are very upset because it seems pretty likely the Cleveland baseball team is going to change its name. And it's funny, going back to the kind of intro about Columbus and Italians. A lot of people are very upset. And I always point out, my family is from Sicily, which is very different than the rest of Italy. And Northern Italians have a derogatory phrase, a derisive phrase, terrone, that they use for Sicilians and Southerners, which is basically people of the land. And they have a caricature of people like, this guy like a hick with a cardboard suitcase and a big polka dot tie. But it also reflects the kind of material conditions of Italy, where the South is incredibly poor and the North, really wields economic power, material power over the South. And, lifespans are different, all that stuff's different. And so, I kind of try to point this out to people that it may just be a name of a team, like Terrone is just a derisive nickname, but it has real life material conditions. Do you think going forward we're going to see, we'll probably see more of these things happen? I don't know if the Chicago Black, didn't one of the NHL teams recently decide to change the name or something, I think. So, and we're seeing, I think Land of Lakes is taking the Indian off.
Buttergirl.
Yeah, so these on one hand, they're symbolic and they don't speak to issues like poverty and alcoholism and stuff like that. But do you think that's we're kind of treading in the right direction now?
I do.
And taking down Columbus statues. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's easier than that, right? All these images, right? Chief Wahoo, or the logo on the Redskins helmet, right? Or I don't know, the Blackhawks logo, right? They're all images of the past.
Yeah.
And if we were to ask students to give me, describe an Indian for me, or we ask kids to draw an Indian, they draw leather and feather and beads. They would draw an image from the past. They don't see Indians as people in the present. And when you view Indians as people who don't have a present, it becomes much easier to dismiss their very legitimate grievances as inauthentic. Right, and I think that's why these stereotyped images are damaging and can be gotten rid of without us losing anything as a society.
Oh, sure. Well, I'll let Scott finish up. Thank you. We're going to actually play a little outro song, which is an Italian novelty song about Columbus Day by a guy named Lou Monti, just to give some people some idea of kind of how silly Italians can be on this issue. But it's good talking to you. It's been too long.
Yeah. And
at some point, if COVID ever lifts, I'll get up your way. Maybe we'll go to a baseball game or do something like that.
Hey, we can meet for lunch in Erie or Hamburg or something. It's halfway. We're probably
absolutely, yeah. It's not far at all. So I got nothing going on here. I'm recording lectures on Zoom, which is very weird, and so I need to get away. But thank you so much.
Thanks, Bob.
I'm really glad we got you on to talk about something that. Was important to me, not just as a lefty, but as, an Italian American, because, I'm actually kind of proud of my people, but not this. Obviously, I'd much rather pay homage to Sacco and Vanzetti and Vito Marcantonio and people like that than a guy who was sailing for Spain and murdered, gazillions, or led to the murder of gazillions of people. So thanks so much. And, you're welcome back to Green and Red anytime. And keep writing all your great stuff. And I urge everybody out there to check out your blog and check out your book and, kind of go from there.
What's the for the blog?
It's michaelleroyoberg.com, one word.
All right, and we'll put it in the episode notes as well.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, folks, you've been listening to Michael Oberg. We've been talking about Indigenous Peoples Day, Columbus Day, and lots of other things. You're listening to Green and Red Podcast. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you want to become a recurring donor, go to patreon.com/Green Red Podcast, or make a one-time donation at greenandredpodcast.org. And of course, always subscribe to us on our YouTube channel. And we will talk to you next time.
In 1492, 3 ships sailed out to sea, the Nina and the Pinta and the Santa Maria. And as they sailed the stormy sea on that historic day, from way up in the crow's nest you could hear Luigi say, "Please, Mr. Columbus, turn the ship around. Take me back, I want to feel my my 2 feet on the ground. Why you tell Isabella that the world is round? Police and Mr. Columbus are turning the ship around. But Chris took out his mandolin and he began to play. They sang and danced until the break of day. They ate up all the provolone and drank up all the wine. But still up in the crow's nest you could hear Luigi crying. Police and Mr. Columbus are turning the ship around. Take me back, I want to feel my 2 feet on the ground. Why you tell Isabella that the world is round? Police and Mr. Columbus are turning the ship around. And then one day they sighted land just off the starboard bow. Columbus said, I told you so, the journey's over now. An Indian shouted from the shore, portate no bit se van. Luigi turned around and said, hey, tu sei pure italiano. Please, Mr. Columbus, don't take me back no more. I'm gonna stay right here and make the chief my father-in-law. I'm glad you tell Isabella that the world is round. I don't know where we are, but there's paisanos all around.